You wrote in your article and your abstract that you don't believe the United States is in decline per se, meaning that it will go down anytime soon. So explain to me why you think so.
Well, I believe, first of all, that history teaches us that all is possible and that all is impermanent. All empires in the past have met their demise. And I believe that the day will come when the American Empire, or Pax Americana, however you wish to describe it, will meet its demise. However, for the foreseeable future, the American Empire will remain a permanent reality. The American Empire is like no other before it. Yes, it has immense, formidable military power. Yes, it is an immense nuclear power. However, there is so much more to the power of the American Empire than simply its hard power. We also have to take into consideration American economic power, which, in my estimation, is as strong, is as powerful as America's military and nuclear might. The American economy ultimately is what ensures the existence of the American Empire. I do not see how the American Empire could have come into being after the Second World War without the presence, without the existence of the American economy. Suffice to say, wherever you find, for example, Coca-Cola, wherever you find Hollywood films, wherever you find McDonald's, you find the hand of America. You find Pax Americana. You find the American Empire. Because all of those brands, all of the aforementioned brands, are part and parcel of the American appeal in the world. And then that takes me on to the export of American culture, which is something the world has been very familiar to since the end of the Second World War. And I mean anywhere in the world. There are very, very few countries which do not have even minor elements of the American culture. So again, where you find jeans, where you find Coca-Cola, you find the hand of America. You find the tentacles of the American Empire. That is why I wrote in my paper that the American Empire, whether you like it or not, is all around us. It surrounds us everywhere in the world. And that is why the American Empire is so different to empires before it. Indeed, I would go as far as to say the American Empire is unique.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that you talk about economy, but numbers probably tell us a different story. Internally and economically, these numbers are grim, actually. In terms of, for example, GDP growth, we see the number for the United States is reportedly around 12%. Well, these other developed nations, for them the number is almost more than double, actually. It's about 26%. And it's not just that. We also see, again, internally, we see poverty on the rise, especially during this COVID pandemic. We see wealth distribution getting really crazy. Like Facebook goes down for 6 hours, and there's talk about Mark Zuckerberg losing $6 billion. Well, many Americans don't understand what $1 billion $1 billion in dollars and in a person's wealth, what it means actually. And we also have the U.S. national debt, which is just out of the charts and meaningless actually at this point because it's so huge. So do you think economically the United States is as sound as it appears?
Well, it's certainly the case that the American economy is beset by some very serious problems which you have just highlighted and highlighted accurately. However, the American economy is still the largest and the most powerful in the world. The American economy is still supreme in the world. Yes, America has gone into recessions on numerous occasions in the last, let's say, in the last 80 years, more or less 80 years since the end of the Second World War. Yet the American empire is able to maintain its hold across the world. And one of the reasons for that is America, alongside, of course, Britain, is the center, is the heart of the global financial sector, is the heart, the center of the global banking sector, is indeed the heart and center of the global capitalist free market economy. It is certainly the case, as I said, and as you said as well, that the Americans are experiencing some very serious problems, especially with the amount of money they owe in the world, for instance, to China. But then many other countries in the world are also experiencing similar problems. And if we talk about China, well, China's economic miracle of the last 4 decades or so, it has been achieved more or less as a result of its trade and investment policy with America. So if America was to say, if the American economy was to say, go into recession overnight, if it was to collapse overnight, well, where would that leave China? China would go into recession overnight. It is not in China's interest, no matter what some very naive and unintelligent commentators say, it is not in China's interest for the American economy to collapse, because where would that leave the Chinese economy? Where would China's investment in the American market be? Where would American exports to China be? So China and America are dependent on one another. It's what I would call an absolutely crucial interdependence on one another. But I think also I should add that in the last few years, the American economy has shown some signs of actually recovering. But it's relative, of course. It's relative. The American economy has received some very serious blows. But the American economy is still able to maintain its military presence across the world. How is it able to do that if the American economy is on the verge of collapse? It simply would not be possible. So, given that the Americans, along with the British, are the heart of the global financial and banking and free market centers of the world, and countries like China and Russia are members of the Anglo-Saxon clubs, the banking sector and the financial sector, it really means that those countries, whether they like it or not, are vulnerable to America because they're part of a club which is essentially the club of Washington and London's.
You're correct in saying that the United States is still at the top of the world economically, but there's also much talk about China taking over the United States as the world's #1 economy, and it's not. Maybe it's not technologically so per se, but we saw actually as COVID hit the world, we saw when China went down, the whole economy of the world almost went down, even in the United States. We saw what happened in US stores. There was a lack of even the basic things like masks and medical gowns and all that stuff. And as soon as China recovered, the world started to recover economically as well. So it's these two countries, the United States and China, are obviously interdependent on each other economically. But don't you see a future in which China would take over the U.S. and become the world's biggest economy with its huge population, 3 times the population of the United States, and the labor power, the production power that it possesses? Donald Trump, we saw, tried to resist this huge economic power from China by bringing some factories and production lines back home. Biden does not believe so much in that theory, but he is talking about somewhat having bilateral relations with China, but also becoming independent from it. Don't you see a future in which China would take over and become the most powerful military, the most powerful economy in the world, meaning automatically that the United States would become a second place economy?
No, absolutely, absolutely not. Yes, it is possible for the Chinese economy to one day become the largest economy in the world, but that wouldn't necessarily mean it would be the most powerful economy in the world. Let's not forget that what the Chinese export is, overwhelmingly speaking, very cheap, very unskilled products. Therefore, whilst I acknowledge that the Chinese have made tremendous, almost extraordinary economic progress in the last 4 years, and especially in the last 20 years, what would happen if another country in the world with a very sizable population, for instance India, was to start producing cheap, unskilled products and was able to sell them to the rest of the world cheaper than what China is able to? Where would that leave China then? The Chinese economy, as I said, is largely an unskilled one. It cannot compare, certainly cannot compare with the American economy. It cannot compare with the British economy, with the French economy, with the German economy, and also with the Japanese economy. So yes, it is possible, and some economists have said that China in the foreseeable future could become the largest economy in the world, but that would not mean it would become the most powerful economy in the world. It's industry. Industry is absolutely crucial in determining the power of an economy. For example, the production of cars. That is absolutely crucial. The production of technological products. Now, I'm very well aware that China is producing technological products, but they're just building them. They're not designing them. Okay, the brains behind technological products are in countries such as Japan, America, and Britain. So yes, the Chinese economy could one day become the largest. Indeed, it's the second largest in the world. It's larger than the Japanese economy. But one can argue quite convincingly that the Japanese economy is more powerful than the Chinese economy because of what Japan produces. And if we turn to the Chinese military, well, again, in the last 20 years, the Chinese have advanced enormously in developing a fighting force. However, the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, is still what I call the largest armed forces museum in the world. That it has 5 million soldiers really doesn't mean that much today in the 21st century, because military power today is defined by technological power, rocket power, high-tech components. The Chinese are heavily reliant on Russia for military technological products. So let me cite an example. The Chinese have successfully developed a 5th generation attack aircraft. So we have to pay credit to the Chinese for that. But in the cockpit of that fifth generation aircraft, there are no high-tech components. The Chinese are trying to negotiate with the Russians for Moscow to sell China the high-tech components required for the Chinese fifth generation aircraft, and the Russians are cautious about doing that. Also, much of the equipment of the People's Liberation Army is obsolete. If China was to become embroiled in a war with Taiwan, and of course Taiwan is Chinese territory, Taiwan is a Chinese province pretending to be independent. But if China was to resort to military force to retake Taiwan, then you would see how the Taiwanese military would inflict grievous blows on the PLA. Why? Because the Taiwanese armed forces is smaller, is better trained, and is equipped with an array of Western high-tech weaponry from Britain and America principally, but also from other countries such as France. And indeed, if China was to become embroiled in a war with Japan, you would see the losses that the Chinese military would receive from the Japanese military. So that China has the largest armed forces in the world doesn't really mean anything. Perhaps it would have meant something. Perhaps it would have meant something 100 years ago, but it does not mean anything in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. I'm happy that you brought military power up, because that's exactly my next question. And you said China's military size does not mean anything. I would argue that America's technological superiority would not mean a lot either, and by that I mean it's not like we're talking about a full blown war between the United States and China, or for that matter between the United States and Russia. So yes, the United States is still the most powerful military force in terms of technology, with arms and missiles and bombs and fighter jets and everything you just mentioned. But what does that military do when you don't have, let me put it this way, when you don't have a significant say in world affairs when it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to even China? And so, like I said, it's not like we're talking about war between these two, or these three nations, if you include Russia. We see in the Middle East, especially, we see Russia involved, as you have written in your paper, in Syria and elsewhere. And we see the United States is withdrawing from Syria, from Iraq, little by little, and we see that in Afghanistan as well. So when we're talking about these peer rivalries between the United States and China and Russia, how significant a role does military power, again in the sense of equipment and arms, really have when the United States is not able to force its will in matters such as in Syria, we see that in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, as you see these days. Iran is sending fuel to Lebanon. Yes, the United States is behind the government, but we've seen Hezbollah and Said Hassan Nasrallah actually rule at least over some parts of the country, and people are taking note of that Iran is helping the government even with sending fuel and helping people, but the United States is basically doing nothing. So what does that military force, again in terms of equipment, do when you don't have the power to change, the matters on the ground in these countries?
America is the predominant outside force in both the Middle East and in North Africa. America's supremacy in the Middle East and in North Africa is indisputable, is irrefutable. The Americans are not withdrawing from Iraq. There is no evidence of any kind whatsoever to corroborate such an assertion. The American hold over Iraq is not just a military one. Once again, it's an economic one. The Americans also control all of the key institutions in Iraq, as you would expect them to do. After all, they illegally invaded. They brutally and illegally invaded Iraq. They control the civil service. My word, if you control the civil service, you control the day-to-day running of a country. This controlling the civil service of a country is as important as controlling a country's territory. The Americans control the media, they control the judiciary, they control academia. They are able to export their culture to Iraq. And again, whether people like this or not, and people know how ardently opposed I am to the American empire, but we have to use our brains. Many people in the Middle East, many Arabs from all the way from the Middle East to North Africa, enjoy the American culture. They enjoy American materialism. They enjoy eating, drinking American drinks and foods. They enjoy watching American Hollywood films. And Iraq is a very good example of that. I'm not saying everyone in Iraq has succumbed to the temptation of the American empire, but America's presence in Iraq is rock solid. Yes, the Americans are very cautious of Iranian influence in Iraq, and I applaud Iran for having developed influence inside of Iraq. But the American supremacy in the Middle East is absolutely crucial to America's hold over the world. And the American military is, of course, enormous. American firepower is, of course, extraordinary. But it's not just about America's military power. If we take what's happened in the Middle East as a result of Russia's legal military intervention in the Syrian conflict, what we have seen emerge there, and again I applaud this, is an unofficial alliance between Moscow, Damascus and Tehran, which is and will continue to challenge American and also British supremacy in the Middle East and also in North Africa. But American supremacy is not going to be brought down by this unofficial alliance. Also, there is a strategic partnership in existence between Moscow and Tehran as a result of how Russia and Iran came together to defeat the Wahhabist terrorist threat in Syria. Again, I commend the strategic partnership between Moscow and Tehran. But that is not going to end America's hold over the Middle East. If we take Lebanon, yes, the Iranians and the Russians historically exercise influence in Lebanon, but America is the leading energy supplier to Lebanon. America is the leading military supplier to Lebanon. America has gathered some of its allies in the Middle East and in North Africa in a partnership in the Eastern Mediterranean to develop the energy which is being found there. And of course, which country is part of that? Lebanon. Let me just cite those countries which America has gathered together to not only benefit in the long term from the revenues of the oil and gas which is being found in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also to solidify even further its hold over the Middle East. Those allies of America are Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. So again, whilst it is true, and I have written this in my paper, I also wrote it in my book, which came out earlier this year, called Arise, Reside. Whilst America doesn't have the room for maneuverability in the Middle East that it once had prior to Russian and Iranian legal military intervention in Syria, it is still the case that the overwhelming amount of countries in the Middle East and in North Africa are in America's orbit and are firmly in America's orbit. And it's not simply the case that those countries and their populations are simply slaves to America. If you want to call them slaves, fine, but I would add in another word, they are willing slaves. Virtually, you take the Arabian Peninsula, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Kuwaitis, the Bahrainis, the Emiratis. They really devote themselves to serving America. And it's not just the politicians. We have to acknowledge many of the people there like the American lifestyle. They like the American dream. They like American materialism. So whilst the day could come when American supremacy erodes in the Middle East and collapses in the Middle East, that is not going to be in our lifetime. That is going to be an event in the distant future. And what is China's influence in the Middle East? I mean, China's influence in comparison to Russia's influence or even Iran's influence is almost negligible. So the Middle East is absolutely crucial to the American empire. And also in the last year or so, we have seen the American empire increase its stand in the Middle East by having orchestrated the establishment of diplomatic relations between Israel and two Gulf countries, and other Gulf countries will soon follow suit. Now, that strengthens Israel in the Middle East, and thereby it strengthens America. Why? Because Israel is the main conduit for American influence and power in the Middle East. So we see the United Arab Emirates, for example, now having diplomatic relations with Israel. Of course, both countries had informal relations for many years, but it's now been made formal. Saudi Arabia has informal relations with Israel. The day will come, I believe sooner rather than later, when those relations between Tel Aviv and Riyadh will become formal. So you can see what's happening in there. The Americans have responded to this informal strategic partnership between Russia, Syria, and Iran by strengthening the position of Israel and also its allies on the Arabian Peninsula, and also by forming an Eastern Mediterranean partnership, which is comprised of some of its allies from the Middle East, such as Lebanon, and also North Africa.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I know you said culturally the United States is having a huge presence in the Middle East and elsewhere, and I completely agree with that. I'm not fond of that, but I can totally get it. Yes, we even have a lot of people in Iran that who are like that. So I understand that culturally the United States is having a influence all around the world, but he also said economically it has a lot of power economically inside Iraq and these countries that you said. But don't you think the United States is overplaying its hand economically with all these sanctions against Iraq, against China, against Russia, against Iran, elsewhere against Cuba, against Venezuela? So the United States is sanctioning a lot of countries all around the world. Don't you think it amounts to overplaying its hand, as my last interviewee would say?
Well, how many decades has Washington been placing sanctions, full sanctions, on countries around the world? It's not just in the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It goes back even before America's entry into the Second World War. So when the Japanese, when Imperial Japan was forging an empire and extended into Indochina, the Americans placed full sanctions on Japan. And of course, that was one of the main factors which accounted for the Japanese attack on the American Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor. So the American economy, even before the American economy became the most powerful in the world, was able to place sanctions on countries around the world. Of course, the American economy before America's entry into the Second World War was not the most powerful in the world. It had the potential to become the most powerful, but it wasn't the most powerful. The Second World War, or America's entry into the Second World War, is what turned the American economy into a superpower. Of course, America's victory, or what as being one of the allies in the Second World War, turned America into a superpower, military superpower, but also an economic superpower. But if we look at today in 2021, yes, America maintained sanctions on many countries across the world, and they've been maintaining those sanctions in Iran's case for over 40 years. In Cuba's case, nearly for 60 years. But how are they able to do that? They're able to do that because the American economy effectively controls the world. That pains me to say that. It disgusts me to say that. It disgusts me to hear from yourself, and also I'm aware of it, that there are people in Iran who have succumbed to the American culture, which I believe is a decadent culture. American society is morally bankrupt, but the American dream, as it's called, and I don't believe it's a dream, I believe it's a nightmare, but the Americans have homed in onto something which is innate, not just in many human beings around the world, whether they're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh. Most people around the world, the Americans have homed in on. There is something innate in most people across the world whereby they are easily tempted by materialism. They are easily tempted by materialism over spiritual values, over cultural values, and I mean true cultural, traditional values. And that is a major factor in explaining the hold that the American economy has around the world. Because it's not just the case, as I said, that America and Britain control the banking sector in the world, which Iran is a member of, which Russia is a member of. Washington and London don't just control the financial sector in the world, they control the stock exchange in the world. And following on from that, you have American soft power. Trainers, Nike trainers, for example. And then you have Disneyland. You can see almost in any country in the world someone walking in a town, sometimes in a village, in a city, and they're wearing a t-shirt or they're wearing a sweatshirt, and it has the American flag on one of the arm sleeves or on the chest. You see the British flag sometimes as well. Remember, Britain and America are the heart of the Anglo-Saxon world. So when you see someone at your local bus stop or your local train station or in your supermarket, and they're wearing Nike trainers or they're wearing a t-shirt which has the American flag on, that means that the American culture is present in your country, whether you like that or not. And that is why the American economy, the American empire, is like no empire before it. Yes, the American economy is plagued by many serious problems at the moment. It owes China an extraordinary amount of money. But I have heard some commentators say that China should call in America's debts and bankrupt America. What an idiotic analysis to put forward. Because if China bankrupted America, and it wouldn't actually be able to do that, but let's just say theoretically China was able to bankrupt America. If America went bankrupt, then China would go bankrupt. That's why the Chinese are not going to call in those debts. That's why China and America are economically dependent on one another, despite there being immense tension between each other. So yes, the American economy is plagued by problems, but I have no doubt that those problems will be overcome at some stage in the future. Poverty levels in America are dreadful. There are 44 million Americans living below the breadline. But again, America has long been beset by social divisions. We have the emergence of Black Lives Matter, which is essentially a neoliberal creation, which is about imposing a diabolical culture on not just people in America, but also in Britain. Let's not forget that BLM idolizes a man, George Floyd, who was a hardened criminal who broke into the apartment of a pregnant black woman and threatened to kill her by jabbing a gun to her stomach. Now, we both know how such a criminal would be punished in Iran. We both know that, and that's something I fully support. We've seen how BLM has a hatred for Christianity, how it has desecrated numerous churches. And of course, BLM doesn't just hate Christianity, BLM hates all religion, including Islam. So BLM is causing a lot of societal problems in America, but the Americans are able to come together and are able to preserve not just their country, not just their way of life, but their hold around the world. Let me just give you one example. When the Japanese were considering their attack on Pearl Harbor, some Japanese military commanders and politicians said that, yes, whilst America is plagued by poverty and other social injustices, while America is bankrupt, morally bankrupt, whilst America is decadent, the Americans will come together to preserve their way of life, and they will never allow anyone to challenge them and indeed to defeat them at home and their hold around the world. That's what the Japanese were saying before they struck Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941. Now, that demonstrates that the America of today is not so dissimilar to the America of then. It is plagued by societal divisions. It is plagued by poverty. It is decadent. It is morally bankrupt. But America is this formidable power that the world prior to the creation of the American Empire had never witnessed before. The American Empire is all around us. It surrounds us in our day-to-day lives, whether we are at home, whether we are on a bus, whether we are in a supermarket, whether we are at work. The sooner we come to accept that and understand that, the more we will come to understand what the American Empire actually is. And as I said at the beginning, the day will come when the American Empire is no more. All is impermanent. Who thought the Roman Empire would collapse? Who thought the Habsburg Empire would collapse? Who thought the Romanov dynasty would collapse? Who thought the Ottoman Empire would collapse? The day will come when the American Empire meets its demise, but not in the foreseeable future. America bounces back. In 2007, most of Latin America was governed by left-leaning, I suppose we could call them socialist governments. And traditionally, historically, Latin America has been America's backyard, so to speak. Well, it didn't take Washington many years to strike back in Latin America, and most of Latin America today, with the notable exception, of course, of Venezuela, is governed by effectively puppet governments of the American empire. So that's just an indication how America can strike back. But America never lost Latin America. It was just governed by left-leaning socialist governments. But America's economic, political and military hold and cultural hold over Latin America was never shaken. So yes, the day will come when the American empire will be consigned to history, but not in our lifetime and not in the next generation's lifetime either.
Okay, you kind of already answered my last question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and you could give it a quick answer because I said you already answered. But I want to bring our interview to a conclusion. So we talked economically with the numbers for the GDP and poverty and etc. Militarily, we didn't discuss in depth the situation in Afghanistan and how chaotic it was. So you could refer to that as well. Geostrategically, we also talked. You said the triangle with Iran, Russia, and Syria, and I could go further and talk about China as well. And this is geostrategically and economically as well, because we see these institutions and organizations being formed, and very recently we saw Iran admitted as a full member in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and China has its Belt and Road Initiative, which is trying to draw in a lot of countries across Asia and Europe. We also see credibility-wise, internally we see Biden's poll number going down. Externally we see the United States kind of isolated in some issues. The most obvious probably is the case with the Iran deal. And I'm not saying that Europeans are being very helpful, but at least there's this rhetorical rift between these two sides, between the United States and Europe on the Iran deal. So do you think these are signs that you said it's not going to happen in our lifetime or in our children's lifetime, but do you see these as signs that gradually the root of this American empire is rotten?
Oh, most certainly. I believe that what we are witnessing in numerous parts of the world today could very well be the formation of the foundation which will eventually bring the American empire tumbling down. I don't dispute that. Indeed, I have said that on numerous times in television interviews, in speeches, and also I have made that point crystal clear in my new book, Arise, Reside. But if we take Afghanistan, I have said from day one of the Taliban's conquest of the country that America and Britain have not left Afghanistan. The Americans and the British concluded an informal agreement with the Taliban in which the Taliban would be allowed to rule the country, and in return the Taliban would have to allow America and Britain to retain their influence in the country. Because it is inconceivable that the Taliban could have conquered the whole of Afghanistan on their own in a matter of just a few weeks. That is inconceivable. The Afghan army had been trained by the Americans, had been well equipped by the Americans. I'm not saying the Afghan army was an effective force. No, I don't believe it was. But it didn't offer any resistance. So we have to ask, how did the Taliban manage it? It takes me back to what I have said during this discussion. America and Britain as well do not need to have soldiers in a country to control that country. They can control the key institutions of a country. And what have we seen since the Taliban conquered Afghanistan? We have seen the Taliban meet with the director of the CIA. We have seen the Taliban meet with the head of MI6, or Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, that's the proper name of Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service. We have heard how Washington and London are starting to condition the American public and the British public to seeing the Taliban as a crucial potential ally in the fight against ISIS. We have seen how the Taliban have said they guarantee the security of Western pipelines in Afghanistan. So the Americans and the British are very much still in Afghanistan. They do not have to have soldiers on the ground, and indeed by the Americans withdrawing their soldiers, that's going to save them money year in, year out, because of course maintaining soldiers in a country so far away, and many soldiers, is going to cost a lot of money. So the Americans, by remaining in Afghanistan, are able to threaten Russia through attempting to destabilize Central Asia. Central Asia is Russia's backyard, so to speak. America can attempt to destabilize even further the Xinjiang province of China's, which is a restless, extremist, terrorist-prone province. And of course, the Americans, by remaining in Afghanistan, are able to limit Iran's influence in the region. So yes, Iran is now a member of the Shanghai Cooperation organization, which is very important. Russia was very happy to see its strategic partner admitted. China was very happy to see its political and economic ally admitted. But we have to put these things into perspective. Yes, it shows that the relationship between Moscow and Tehran and Beijing and Tehran is growing, but that's not going to make American policy makers lose sleep overnight, so to speak. Because if the Americans had been militarily defeated by the Taliban, then that would demonstrate that something has gone fundamentally wrong with the American military. But the American military was not defeated. And indeed, the American military and the Taliban have been cooperating with each other for over 10 years now. And of course, we have to take into consideration the opium trade. You know, the British Empire was the empire which controlled opium. Then the American Empire in the 20th century took it over. And of course, ever since the Americans and the British have been in Afghanistan, we have seen the production of opium skyrocket. And of course, the Americans and the British want to retain their control of the opium. So the Taliban will receive a very significant amount of the revenues from the export of opium, but those in control of the opium trade, ultimately America and Britain, will continue to receive an immense amount of money from the opium trade. So I believe that sooner rather than later, we will see the establishment of diplomatic relations between Washington and Kabul and London and Kabul on the justification that the Taliban has changed. They're no longer the Taliban that they were from 1996 to 2001, that the Taliban is crucial in fighting against ISIS. Well, of course, that's how the American and British establishments will justify their relationships with the Taliban to the British and American publics. But of course, unofficially, the relationships between the Taliban and Washington and the Taliban and London is in existence as we speak now. It's been in existence for over 10 years. It just has to be formalized, like how Saudi Arabia has a very, very powerful relationship with Israel. It's just an informal relationship. That one day, that will change. It will become a formal relationship. And I would add as well about the China's One Belt or One Road initiative. Yes, the Americans are keeping a very watchful eye on that. But remember, the One Road initiative is going to create tension between Russia and China. Why? Because China wants Central Asia to be part of the One Road initiative. Russia wants Central Asia to remain part of Moscow's Eurasian Economic Union. The Chinese and the Russians are not friends. Yes, they have a very strong relationship with one another, but as I wrote in my book, Arise Rossiya, it is a relationship of necessity. It is not a friendship. The Russians need the Chinese market upon which to export the gas and oil to. The Chinese need Russia in order to receive oil and gas, and the Chinese are hoping that one day Russia will start supplying them with water, fresh water, because China lacks fresh water. Also, the Chinese are heavily dependent, as I said at the beginning of the discussion, on advanced Russian components and advanced Russian weaponry. But Russia and China, they might be allies, but they're not friends. And Russia and China, deep down, do not like each other for a number of reasons. When sanctions were placed on Russia by America and the European Union at the start of 2014 because of the crisis in Ukraine, which the West had caused, Russia desperately needed a new contract for its oil and gas in order to sustain the losses that the Western sanctions were going to exact on the Russian economy. So they looked to China. But the agreement that the Russians and the Chinese signed benefited China far more. The Russians should have had the amount that the Chinese paid for Russian oil and gas should have been far greater than what they actually agreed. But the Chinese, being very shrewd, very ruthless operators, saw that Russia was in no position to negotiate the exact price. So the Chinese told the Russians, in private, of course, we are going to offer a large amount, but far less than what you should actually get, because we know that you need money and you need money now. So the Russians saw that as another example of how the Chinese are not their friends. They are political allies, they're economic allies. We could say they're military allies, but both countries do not like each other. The Russians are also very suspicious over how America and China are economically interlocked with one another. The Russians have never forgotten the border battles fought between the Soviet Union and China in the 1960s. Russia believes that some in the Chinese establishment have territorial expansions, have territorial designs on parts of Western Siberia. So yes, China's One Belt initiative is something the Americans are watching very carefully. They will attempt to use their allies in the region, if not to block the One Belt initiative, to limit the One Belt initiative. For example, Pakistan. Pakistan is a crucial friend and ally of America's. So the Americans will use Pakistan to limit China's economic influence in the region, even though, of course, Pakistan and China are allies, but they are only allies because they have a mutual adversary, namely India. So the One Belt initiative is an audacious initiative of China's, but it will cause tension with Russia because it will come into conflict with with Moscow's Eurasian Economic Union, but also the Americans will use their influence in Afghanistan and in that region to try and limit the full potential of China's One Belt initiative.